Interviewing best practices. The objectives for this course: interview process, types of interviews, preparing for the interview, conducting the interview, and controlling the interview. Let's start with the interview process. The first step is pre-screening. It can depend on the company or job position, but in many cases, someone who is not super technical will conduct the pre-screening session, as they just want to find some basic information about the candidate and to filter out the noise. They would like to eliminate the candidates that aren't really going to be able to pass more rigorous interviews or who aren't really serious about the job. This way, the time of the interviewers is not wasted. After that typically comes the technical interview. This process enables the interviewer to ask the candidate about their domain knowledge, added to various questions from the job description and some situational-based questions. Lastly, they ask questions about their past work experience, if any. The second interview is typically the last interview. It may also be a panel interview. This is usually taken by managerial level executives who ask about domain knowledge, the candidate's background, past work experience, and some situational-based questions. From here, the final step is the job offer. Based on the performance of the last two rounds, the candidate is formally offered the job by the employer. Now, there are generally 4 types of interviews. Let's look at these categories. The first is the telephone pre-screen interview. Next is the direct one-on-one interview. Then we have behavioral interviews. And finally, we have group interviews. The telephone pre-screen interview is useful for assessing whether an applicant's qualifications, experience, skills, and salary needs are compatible with the position and the organization. Telephone interviews are often used to narrow the field of applicants who will be invited for in-person interviews. During this pre-screening stage, the interviewer should ask the applicant enough carefully prepared questions to determine whether he or she is, in fact, a viable candidate for the position. Next is typically the direct one-on-one interview, or the face-to-face or in-person interview. This more traditional interview can be structured or unstructured, and it can be approached in one of several ways, depending on the types of information the interviewer seeks. The 3 most common approaches to one-on-one employment interviews are behavioral, competency-based, and situational. Let's look more closely at behavioral and competency-based approaches. Both of these aim to discover how the interviewee performed in specific situations. The logic is based on the principle that past performance predicts future behavior. In other words, how the applicant behaved in the past indicates how he or she will behave in the future. In a behavioral or competency-based interview, the interviewer's questions are designed to determine if the applicant possesses certain attributes or skills. Instead of asking how the applicant would handle a hypothetical situation, the interviewer asks the applicant how he or she did, in fact, handle a particular situation in the past. A situational approach is an interview technique that gives the candidate a hypothetical scenario or event and focuses on his or her past experience, behaviors, knowledge, skills, and abilities by asking the candidate to provide specific examples of how the candidate would respond given the hypothetical situation described. This type of interview reveals how an applicant thinks and how he or she would react in a particular situation. There are 2 types of group interviews: candidate groups and panel groups. In a candidate group interview, a candidate is in a room with other job applicants who may be applying for the same position. Each candidate listens to information about the company and the position and may be asked to answer questions or to participate in group exercises. Candidate group interviews are less common than panel group interviews. In a panel group interview, a candidate is interviewed individually by a panel of 2 or more people. This type of group interview is usually a question and answer session, but a candidate may also be asked to participate in an exercise or a test. These panel interviews can be structured or unstructured. Before the candidate is even in your office for the interview, there are some steps you can take to make sure the interview is a success. Preparing for the interview. Determine the critical success factors of the job. Rank, according to the job specifications, the most important qualities, experiences, education, and characteristics that a successful candidate would possess. Make a list of qualities, skills, and types of experience to use to screen resumes and job interview candidates. Select specific questions to determine whether an applicant possesses the critical success factors. Decide the type of interview process that will be used. Review beforehand the job description and the resume of each candidate that will be interviewed. Schedule a planning meeting with the appropriate attendees, such as coworkers, an indirect but interested manager, or even internal customers of the position. Determine who will interview the candidates. Plan the interview and the follow-up process. Decide on the applicant screening questions for the telephone screens. And identify the appropriate questions for post-interview assessment of candidates by each interviewer. Conducting the interview is very important. The manner in which human resource professionals and hiring managers interview applicants can be pivotal in identifying the top candidates for a job. A successful and effective interview is one in which both the interviewer and the interviewee receive accurate information and can make informed decisions about the applicant's suitability for the job. Remember, the interview process can be stressful for both the interviewer and the interviewee. It is normal for an applicant to feel nervous, so interviewers should try to put the person at ease from the moment he or she enters the room. By helping the interviewee feel relaxed and comfortable, the interviewer stands a better chance of obtaining a clear idea of the applicant's abilities and personality. Once the interview is underway, there are some strategies you can take to control the interview. First, minimize internal and external distractions so that you can focus only on what the applicant is saying. Second, listen to the full answer before asking the candidate the next question. Third, clarify the candidate's answers if necessary and ask if more information is needed. Occasionally, it may be useful for interviewers to restate an applicant's reply in their own words to make sure they understood. And fourth, watch the interviewee's facial expressions and body language. In summary, there are 4 stages of the interview process: pre-screening, technical interview, the panel interview, and lastly, the job offer. These stages of the interview process can be taken in different ways. For example, you can have a direct one-on-one interview, a telephone interview, behavioral interviews, and group interviews. In a telephonic interview, the interviewer calls the candidate for pre-screening by asking some basic questions like background check or past experiences, if any. In a direct one-on-one interview, the interviewer takes the process through face-to-face meeting with the candidate. Then comes the behavioral interviews, where the interviewer's questions are designed to determine if the applicant possesses certain attributes or skills, asking psychometric questions to check his or her posture and body language. Lastly, the group interviews, where a candidate is in a room with other job applicants who may be applying for the same position. And you'll also want to identify the appropriate questions for the post-interview assessment of candidates by each interviewer. Let's take a quiz now to test your knowledge. Behavioral and competency-based approaches is all about what? A, discovering how the interviewee performed in specific situations. B, deciding on the applicant screening questions for the telephone screens. Or C, asking situational-based questions. The answer is A, discovering how the interviewee performed in specific situations. True or false? Pre-screening is necessary before the final round of interviews. This is true. When taking interviews for a managerial position, is it necessary to ask situational-based questions? Yes. What is the very first step in the interview process? A, send a thank you note. B, brainstorm questions. C, contact a person to set up a time. Or D, research background information. D, researching background information should be your first step. When is behavioral competency evaluated? Is it during the telephone screening round? B, during the one-on-one interview? Or C, during the Skype interview? During the one-on-one interview is when behavioral competency is evaluated. Is it necessary to have a network connection to sit for a Skype interview? Yes, you need a network connection to have a Skype interview. What's one of the biggest mistakes employers make when crafting job ads? A, including a salary range. B, listing too many requirements. C, not including a Glassdoor ranking. Or D, not using a clear job title. D, not using a clear job title. That's very important in a job ad. What is the top source of hiring? Where do you find candidates that are the top candidates? Is it A, on job boards, B, on the website LinkedIn, C, through referrals, or D, at career fairs? C, referrals, word of mouth is a good way to find top talent. What is the most time-consuming part of recruiting? Is it A, scheduling interviews, B, screening resumes, C, meeting with hiring managers, or D, closing candidates? It's B, screening resumes to decide which candidates to bring for further interviews is typically the most time-consuming part of recruiting. Job postings should include A, the company's unique selling points, B, a listing of benefits, C, essential requirements, or D, all of the above. D, all of the above are elements of a good job posting. Thank you.